In 1978, it was named a Chicago landmark as a, quote, exemplification of the cultural, economic, social, and historical heritage of the city of Chicago. Today we're discussing Chicago's Fine Arts Building. I'm Tommy Henry, and this is the Chicago History Podcast. The Fine Arts Building on South Michigan Avenue has been around for more than 130 years, and while it is a much beloved building by many historians and architecture enthusiasts, it still seems to be a hidden gem. Despite its prime location at 410 South Michigan Avenue, across from Grant Park and adjacent to the Auditorium Theater, the Fine Arts Building is often overlooked by the general public and even some Chicagoans, especially when compared to more famous city landmarks. A new recently released book may give readers a new look into why the Fine Arts Building is a must-visit location in Chicago. Here to talk about his new book, Chicago's Fine Arts Building, Music, Magic, and Murder, is author Keir Graff, who writes thrillers, mysteries, and nonfiction for adults, and mystery and adventure novels for younger readers. Recent works include The Royal Game, co-authored with Linda Jaffe Hull as Linda Keir, and The Double Trouble Puzzle, which Graff co-authored with James Patterson for the Minerva Keen's Detective Club series for middle school readers. Graff is the editor of the anthology A Million Acres and co-editor of the crime fiction anthology Montana Noir. The former executive editor of Booklist, he lives in the Chicago area, where he is the co-founder of the much-loved literary gathering Publishing Cocktails and the co-host of the Filmographers podcast. He provides essays, advice, and reading recommendations in his free monthly newsletter, Graff Paper. Keir Graff, welcome.
Thank you. Really happy to be here.
For listeners not familiar with you, tell us a little bit about yourself, including how you started out in Missoula, Montana, and ended up in Chicago.
Well, I didn't have much choice about the Missoula, Montana part. I was born there. I'm the only Montana native in my family. My dad grew up traveling all around. My mom was a California girl who fell in love with my dad and Montana. And my older brother even was born in California. So I was the first Montana native. It's interesting that there's a strong Chicago and Montana connection that I kind of only learned about as I grew up and became a bit more of a reader. Norman McLean, famous for River Runs Through It, taught in Chicago and summered in his cabin out in Montana. I've met other writers who have like family history, ancestors and things who came west on the train from Chicago. I did it in reverse. I started in Montana and came out here. I had always thought I was going to, end up in New York or something because I was a young man with literary aspirations. Didn't make it that far. I settled here, and I'm so glad I did.
Your first novel, Cold Lessons, was published in 2007 under the pseudonym Michael McCulloch. Was Keir Graff not a distinct enough name, or was the pseudonym thing your idea or some well-intentioned editor?
That was my idea. That was a book that I had been working on off and on for the previous decade. And by the time I received an offer of publication, I felt that it was, while I was proud of it, it was maybe not my best work. And so I decided to reserve my real name for my next book, which I felt would be better, arguably better. But the thing I quickly discovered was that, I'm a fan of pen names and mysterious authorial identities. But the thing that I discovered that I hadn't anticipated was that it's very hard to promote a book that your name isn't on the cover of. And of course, that is something that I've gone on to do again and again. But that was my first lesson in trying to promote a book that didn't appear to be written by me.
Well, sure. How do you go to book signings and then you have to remember what name you used and you start signing your real name and then you have to scratch it out and then people get angry with you? That's got to be embarrassing.
One of the first articles about that book, I was very proud. They profiled me in Time Out Chicago, but then of course the whole article was about the fact that I was using a pseudonym. So I don't know. In retrospect, I might have done it differently.
Let's talk about your latest book, Chicago's Fine Arts Building, Music, Magic, and Murder, which takes readers behind the scenes of this cultural hub across from Grant Park in the city's landmark historic Michigan Boulevard district. What is your first memory of the Fine Arts Building, and how did this project come about?
Wow. Okay, so I have two early memories of the Fine Arts Building. One is that when I was living in Uptown, which is where my wife and I lived in Uptown for a long, long time, and we had a neighbor on the same floor, Grace Cole, who was an astonishingly talented painter. She did portraits in oil, which is felt very old-fashioned. Her craft was just unparalleled. And we came to visit her at her studio one time, and she had one of the studios that has the half moon windows overlooking Lake Michigan. And sadly, Grace is no longer with us. This was quite some time ago, but I was just, smitten. I felt like I had stepped into another world, a world of art and antiquity. And the Fine Arts Building, I think for anybody who steps into it, feels like a time machine because it just feels like you're entering a world where people are doing things differently. They're doing things the way people have done them often for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so that was my first taste. I just thought, what is this cool building? And interestingly, I don't even remember whether we took the manually operated elevators, which I'm sure we'll talk about, or whether I climbed the stairs, but I just thought her studio was phenomenal. And then the second time I came was when there was a major publishing convention at McCormick Place, and a local literary agent who was then housed in the Fine Arts Building had a party, and they rented some rooms. Their offices were in the annex of the Fine Arts Building, but they rented some rooms off the Venetian Court. And I remember thinking, I hadn't seen the Venetian Court on my previous visit, and on a summer night in this party filled with publishing people, book people, my kind of people, I remember walking out into the Venetian Court and looking up and seeing this little patch of Chicago sky, and just thinking, where am I? This is magic. This is the world. Growing up in Montana, a million miles away from the centers of publishing and that kind of stuff. This is the kind of place I dreamed of being my whole life. It made a huge impression on me, but at that time I never had any sense that I would return, because I had a job. I was working at Booklist magazine. I continued to work there for many, many years. Finally, I left Booklist in 2019 and was just working at home. My solitude and bliss was interrupted within less than a year because of the pandemic, and suddenly my kids and my wife, they all had their home offices as well. Mine was the smallest and darkest of the home offices, which didn't seem right somehow. But my friends Javier Ramirez and Kristen Ramirez, now Ramirez, opened a bookstore on the second floor. They took over the Dial bookstore on the second floor of the Fine Arts Building, kind of in the waning time of the pandemic. And they said, why don't you get a studio in the building? And I just kind of laughed it off. I thought, well, I mean, I can write at home for free. But I spent more and more time hanging out with them, in the early days, helping out at the bookstore a little bit, unboxing books, or I even worked the counter a few days when they were shorthanded. The more time I spent in the building, the more the magic worked on me, and the more I thought, yeah, I really need to be a part of this place. And so I made a fateful phone call, and I called the offices and said, are there any studios available? And as luck would have it, there were three to choose from at that point. And that is not always the case nowadays.
Most Chicagoans know the building at 410 South Michigan Avenue as the Fine Arts Building, but it wasn't always called that. What was its original name, and for what was it used?
Well, so when it opened originally, it was the Studebaker brothers. I'm going to get the exact name wrong, but it was a carriage factory and showroom, and it was, this was horse-drawn carriages. The metal parts were forged in South Bend. Many of the carriages were assembled here. The lower floors were showrooms. The upper floors were storage and assembly, and undoubtedly some administrative offices. And it was an 8-story building as well, it's now a 10-story building, which is very interesting. So if you look at the photos of the building when it opened, it really has a beautiful roof line and these kind of little towers along the roof line. The Studebakers outgrew the building pretty quickly after they moved in, and they moved around a couple blocks away to a building on South Wabash that was designed by Solon S. Beeman, same guy who designed the original building. And they probably would have just sold it, except a guy named Charles Curtis, who, fascinating guy. He was the son of a Chicago mayor. He was a Civil War veteran. He had experience both in retail, like he had clerked at the for the predecessor of Marshall Field. He had also worked for Lyon and Healy, like a harp manufacturer. He had helped get a music-related building off the ground. And he said to the Studebakers, look, I think we could do something really cool with this. And he pitched them on the idea of a, an arts-centered building. And this is a really important distinction. It was a commercially designated building because a lot of times people think of this place as this kind of magic arts colony where, it's some kind of utopia or some sort of socialist dream or something. This building has always been, commercially operated. It's, the owners, some more effectively than others, have run it to collect rent and make a profit. But he pitched them on this, and they thought he had the connections and the vision and the know-how, and he said, "Well, go for it." And so they converted the building in astonishingly short period of time, so roughly, I think it was less than a year, and added. Not only did they add 2 stories, they raised the top floor and built on 2 more, but they repurposed it. I believe the architect Charles Swan, who had a lot of history with this building, called it one of the greatest kind of retrofits of its time because they took this commercial building for carriages and whatnot and broke it into music studios and performance spaces, two beautiful halls on the first floor. And when it reopened in 1898, it was an instant success. It was beautiful. It was perfectly suited to its function, and it was off and running for its new life that it's had for more than 125 years.
The Studebaker Brothers Manufacturing Company moved down the street in 1896. So, transforming from a carriage company to a fine arts building, how did that reflect changes in Chicago's cultural landscape in the late 19th century, early 20th century?
Yeah, well, so it's interesting. One of the reasons that Curtis recognized this was a good place to do what he had in mind was that this was quickly becoming a cultural hub. South Wabash was already known as Music Row. It had a lot of music dealers, piano stores, sheet music shops. It was a bustling hive for that already. But then the Art Institute was just north of this building. And shortly after the Studebakers finished their building, immediately to the south, the auditorium building was completed. And so suddenly you had this kind of like density. And there was also the Athenaeum building, which was home to a number of artists, was not far away. So he recognized that this was like perfectly situated. This was already a place that Chicagoans were headed towards. Chicago was obviously, still rebuilding, but had made huge strides in rebuilding from the fire. People were turning from just kind of rebuilding and survival to like, this is a bustling engine of commerce. Like we have money to spend on arts and culture, and we want to showcase our city in the best possible light. So a lot of civic boosters were trying to create these arts organizations. And, one of the most important things to think about the Fine Arts Building at that time is in terms of its tenants was, it's always been a hub for music, music instruction, paid most of the rent in the early days. I mean, we tend to remember some of the painters and sculptors and people who were here, but music lessons then and now are just a huge kind of reason for being for the Fine Arts Building. There were musical colleges here, a lot of. I'm trying to remember. I think it was like over 100 music instructors when it in the first few years were operating out of the building. It's such an interesting thing because Chicago was built in large part by railroads and by slaughterhouses and stockyards and things. And, these are these kind of brawny industrial things. Like that's where the money comes from. But what do people want to do to legitimize themselves as soon as they have this money? It's like, well, we have taste. Right. And so they want to support these civic functions. And so I think the thing I was eventually trying to get to was the fact that in addition to the music instruction that was headquartered here, there were lots of clubs and organizations and arts societies and things. And there's this massive list. Lists are boring. People can find them. They'll find them in my book, whether it was for like women's suffrage and women's groups or social movements, or whether it was people want to learn the art of bookbinding, or kind of like or arts and crafts, or learn how like metalworking or things like all these things found a home in the Fine Arts Building.
I did an episode a few weeks back about 5 pioneering women in Chicago, including Grace W. Trout, known for her efforts in the suffrage movement, since you mentioned it. What role did the Fine Arts Building play in the women's suffrage movement in Chicago?
I feel like something I was about to say a moment ago is that like I feel like every time I talk about this stuff, I feel like I want to tell people to take what I say with a grain of salt because I'm not a historian. I'm a novelist who fell in love with this building and the history of this building. But yes, there were prominent suffrage organizations that were headquartered here. And again, like these women's clubs and societies that found themselves turned away elsewhere, they're kind of anytime you create a nucleus of activity and it draws other like-minded people. So when one suffrage organization headquarters itself in the Fine Arts Building, suddenly somebody else sees that as an opportunity, and it's so one of the reasons the Fine Arts Building is so important is it's so big, right? It contains so many people and so many organizations that it creates this looming example of like I can go and do likewise. And so, I can't speak expertly to the history of that. It's touched upon briefly in my history in the book, which is, really a broad overview. The book itself it's a coffee table book. It's filled with beautiful images, like nearly 200 photographs, historical images that really tell the story of the building over the last 125 years or plus. And the text is this is crazy, but the text derives from an article in New City that was published shortly after the 125th anniversary of the Fine Arts Building. And it was the longest article New City had ever published. It basically took over the whole issue, which was an amazing act of generosity by the publisher, Brian Higelke, who commissioned the story. But I actually shortened the text for the book because on the one hand, how much text does anybody want to read about one building in particular? I mean, this building in a way tells the history of the whole city of Chicago, but it's also one building. And also the images that we were coming up with and that were contributed by Alexander Attia at the Fine Arts Building, who was like the art building's archivist, and that were being located by Kendra Hupaska, the art designer for Trope, were just so astonishing and so stunning that we just felt like we wanted more and more images. Like I wanted to show this big, beautiful story visually, so you can see the suffragettes standing in their open-topped car on Michigan Avenue in their, 1890s finery. And in a way, I feel like that tells the story as well as I can do it with words.
You mentioned the murals. I knew very little about the murals in the building before reading your book, so please talk a little bit about those.
Yeah, so the murals on the 10th floor are fascinating. It was a group project that was spearheaded by the Leyendecker brothers, who, and again, because I'm not a historian and my memory is terrible, I'm not going to, I always need notes for first names. But anyway, they were very briefly in the building. They were commercial artists. They were not fine artists like so many of the people in the building. When we think of the glory days of the Fine Arts Building at a time when a New York newspaper called the 10th floor Chicago's Parnassus, which I just love. Most of the people in here were aspiring to do fine art, lovely sculptures that would stand the test of time, or commissioned portraits of, society people and whatever. But they were all working in this very classical mode. But the Leyendeckers were they were commercial, and they became basically, they didn't stay in Chicago long. They went off to New York and became illustrators for like magazine advertisements and stuff like that, which is and in fact one of them went on to create the Arrow Shirt Man, which is, some people say, is one of the first advertising icons of the 20th century. And he based Arrow Shirt Man on his lover, or if I have the story right, one or multiple lovers. But it's this very like striking, gorgeous, handsome man who, we think of Don Draper as being like a mid-century thing in the 20th century, but like this was, the Roaring 20s. You have Arrow Shirt Man, and it was drawings, it wasn't photographs, so he could kind of like idealize it however he wanted. So he went on to be famous in that line, but I think came to Chicago from St. Louis, was here in Fine Arts Building for only a few years, and then basically curated this stunning set of murals at the top of the light wells in the building under the skylights that are in various styles. Kind of, I think Art Nouveau might describe most of them pretty well. They're in varying states of, the ones on one stairwell are very beautifully restored. The other set seems like it needs a little bit of work to kind of bring back the original glow. But that is one of the iconic images of Chicago. And something people need to know is that this building, even though it's privately owned and it's a place of business, the owners, bless them, welcome the public in. So people listening to this, you can come to the Fine Arts Building in Chicago at 410 South Michigan, and you can take the elevators to the top floor, and there's some interpretive signs that'll explain what you're looking at. And you may wander the halls, and you may look at the placards alongside the studios and see who the historic tenants were. And yeah, it's astonishing. Those murals were used recently. Rebecca Mackay did a literary portrait of Chicago, and that was it was a drawn illustration, but a drawing of those accompanied the article in the New York Times. If you see it, you won't forget it. It's definitely a must see on any visit to Chicago.
We dropped a couple of exciting names who have had places in the Fine Arts Building, including you, which is super cool. Other than you and the people you've named, who are the other notable artists, writers, musicians who have had or currently do have studios in the Fine Arts Building?
People are very excited by the fact that Gillian Flynn moved in not that long ago, and she is just a lovely, not only a great writer, but just a lovely human being and an incredible supporter of up and coming writers. I'm not saying that to encourage other people to start spamming her with requests for help, but I am just saying that she is somebody who I think has a bigger footprint in Chicago than people realize as far as just being helpful and a cheerleader for other writers. So she's one current person who's been here. When you look, there are some interesting names of people who have just kind of who've maybe had they haven't had a studio here, but they've been shaped by this place. Andrew Bird is a famous, obviously, beloved in Chicago, and he was a member of the Chicago Youth Symphony Orchestra. So I love to picture, young Andrew Bird with his violin, taking the elevators up to the 8th floor, which is the floor where I write. I get to see these young musicians today. Maybe there's another Andrew Bird among them, probably several. Laurie Anderson, somebody who's like, maybe not as well known today, but definitely a huge touchstone for me as far as when I was listening to music and when I was coming up, just definitely a hero. She also was in CYSO, and I believe she's come back to actually do something with them once or twice over the years. And then there are, everybody loves to, going way back, everybody always loves to talk about, any connection you can brag about to Frank Lloyd Wright, people want to brag about. Frank Lloyd Wright is actually, he's more notable for what he designed here and that's no longer here than his residency here, because as best as I understand, he only had a studio here for around a year. So he's not really a famous resident, but he did design two very important spaces, Brown's Bookstore and the Thurber Art Galleries, which sadly no longer exist in their present form. But in talking to the folks at W.H. Lee Violins on the 5th floor, they now have the space that was the Thurber Art Galleries, and they were pulling down some of their ceilings in, doing some renovations one time, and they found some of the original skylights that had been put in by Frank Lloyd Wright. And so there are just these little buried nuggets of magic everywhere. Another fascinating connection, again, going way, way back, but the illustrator and publisher of The Wizard of Oz were side by side in the offices on the 10th floor. Of course, L. Frank Baum was not a tenant here, but he was an Oak Parker and wrote the books in Illinois. And so the illustrations and the publication happened right here in the Fine Arts Building.
I had also read in your book that Frank Lloyd Wright briefly occupied Studio 1020 from 1910 to 1911, which I thought, that's super cool. And to your point,
Yeah.
Everybody loves to make the connection either to Frank Lloyd Wright or every apartment building I moved into in the 90s. They said, Al Capone had a mistress here. And I said, there's no way he had that much stamina to have mistresses in every one of these buildings. So
I've been told about many Al Capone connections to the Fine Arts Building as well. I have not verified a single one of them, but I've had elevator operators pull me aside and say, well, this is where he had his office. And then I've had somebody else tell me that he ran a brothel on the roof, because there is a really interesting room on the roof. I think it would have been very difficult to operate a brothel on the roof of a 10-story building. For one, if you got raided, how is anybody getting away? You're stuck up there. Yeah, if every Al Capone rumored connection were true, man, he would have. I mean, it would have been a global enterprise employing like 50,000 people.
You mentioned before the elevators. People not familiar with the Fine Arts Building, tell us about the elevators and also about how Durkin Hall connects to the building and the elevators.
Tommy Durkin was a long time and beloved, well, mostly beloved. He was a bit of a salty character, elevator operator here in the Fine Arts Building. He came over to Chicago from Ireland as a teenager and got a job at the Fine Arts Building operating elevators and stuck around for half a century. Tried to retire. People insisted he come back. He worked part-time until shortly before his death. I hope they didn't work him to death. But he was the kind of the guardian and security and welcomer and everything. He was famous for um, stopping an elevator car between floors and telling inspectors, "You're not going to give us any trouble, are you?" Uh, anyway, so the first floor, the main hall as you come into the building is now known as Durkin Hall in honor of Tommy Durkin. And he was one of the people who made the Fine Arts Building the Fine Arts Building because, one of the things I write in the book is that the early days of the building were trying to emulate this old world elegance and old school artistry and very, very high toned and very probably exclusive, I would say. But by the middle of the century, certainly the building's fortunes began to fade during the Great Depression and continued to fade for many, many decades after that. But in some ways, that's kind of when I think it hit its stride, is this kind of more egalitarian, more Chicago kind of institution, because Tommy Durkin became like the social mayor of the building. He would throw two annual parties, a Christmas party and a St. Patrick's Day party, although he called one of them the Notre Dame party. He became a diehard Notre Dame fan. But he would throw these parties in the basement, in the boiler room, and the grungy workspaces of the building. But he would invite the artists in the building, and it was a can't miss event. People, whoever they were, even the building's owner tried to arrange his travel schedule around Tommy's party so he wouldn't miss one of these parties. And I think that's one of the things that not only speaks to the greatness of this building, but Chicago. One of the things that I love about Chicago as a writer here is that we have a bigger literary scene than people realize, but it's small enough that it can be very democratic. I think when we have a party here in Chicago, you have booksellers and writers and publishers and agents and editors. And in New York, it's just so big and so sprawling that I think it can't help but become more stratified. And so I think Tommy kind of exemplifies the spirit of that. Now, the elevators are definitely one of everybody's favorite attractions. I think sometimes it's a little bit of a tension point because, the elevator operators are kept busy by the normal business of the building. But of course, they do give rides to tourists as well. I will say to anybody who's visiting the building, be kind and be patient. It's a very different world from what people expect. When you ring the bell for these manually operated elevators, they don't see any light up signal. There's no way they have of magically knowing where you are. They have to go looking for you, so a lot of times people will ring the bell and then stand right next to the wall. And then, of course, the elevator operators can't see them. So ring the bell, take a few steps back, stand where they can see you. They'll get to you as soon as they can. But it's such a modern elevators, I say in the book, are basically like teleportation, right? Like the doors close, you magically appear on another floor. You're not aware of traveling. In the Fine Arts Building, you see yourself passing between floors and you feel the thing moving a little bit. And sometimes it stops with a little bit of a lurch and it feels a little more like a carnival ride. Sadly, the owners are modernizing the elevators. It's going to take a while. And it's not because they hate them or anything. It's very difficult to repair them. The parts are not made anymore. If any crucial parts break, they would have to be machined. The guy who repairs them is retiring soon. He doesn't even live in Illinois. So there are all sorts of reasons, unfortunately, why they do have to replace the elevators. So if you want to experience the magic of elevator rides as they were before the turn of the last century, you get to the Fine Arts Building in the next year.
A little background on the cinemas that many of a certain age remember in the Fine Arts Building. In 1982, M&R Amusement Company converted the Fine Arts Studebaker Theater and the building's smaller World Playhouse Theater into the Fine Arts Theater's multiplex, mainly showing art and independent films. When Rob Reiner's This Is Spinal Tap opened in late March of 1984 in Chicago, it was only at one cinema, the Fine Arts Theater. Later that same year, the Jonathan Demme-directed Talking Heads concert film Stop Making Sense came to Chicago's Fine Arts Theater for a run that seemed to go on for years. In addition to showing foreign language films, the Fine Arts Theater was the place to go for quirky films you'd be unlikely to find at the General Cinema or Plitt theaters in the 1980s. The 1987 Stephen Frears directed Prick Up Your Ears, starring Gary Oldman and Alfred Molina, about the playwright Joe Orton and his lover Kenneth Hallowell. Hollywood Shuffle, directed by Chicago and Robert Townsend, Spalding Gray in Swimming to Cambodia, Alex Cox's Repo Man, John Sayles, Brother from Another Planet, and others. When M&R sold their theater chain to Lowe's in 1988, the Fine Arts Theater switched to playing mostly Hollywood films. The complex was closed in November of 2000, which resulted in the Studebaker going dark for about 15 years. Back to Keir. In December of 1982, the theater was converted into a cinema, becoming the first theaters in the Loop to open in 10 years, finally closing in November of 2000. Now, if I read your bio correctly, you moved to Chicago in 1996. Did you get to see any movies there before it shuttered?
Yeah, I did. I did. I sadly I can't remember which movies I saw. I've never had a good memory for that, but I remember it was the Sony Fine Arts or whatever it was called at the time, and I lived in Marina City for a couple of years around that time, and so it wasn't that far. And I remember going to the strange little theater off Michigan Avenue, and the first few times I saw movies there, it was in these little tiny theaters. And I just thought, oh, whatever, they carved these little theaters out of this old building. And then one time, I got to see a movie in the Studebaker, which is the original theater, which was still pretty big because what they had done is they had cut up the two theaters into four theaters. And I now know how it was laid out. Basically, it was like the smallest theaters were kind of in the backstage space of the larger theaters. And so those were very, very small theaters. But the theater in the Studebaker, and I was there with maybe five people. And so I'm sitting in this just grand old shabby faded palace. And I just thought, again, it was kind of like, what is happening? So yeah, I treasure those memories. But it's so much better now that the Studebaker is coming back to life as a live performance venue. It's phenomenal. Their schedule is getting busier and busier, and the breadth of programming is astonishing. I mean, they do show an occasional movie from time to time. They showed an old black and white silent movie called Aelita, Queen of Mars, and had Mark Rebo do live accompaniment, which was super cool. But they're much more likely to show musicals. They recently had a burlesque show called The Empire Strips Back. So there's really something for everyone.
The title of your book promises music, magic, and murder, and you don't disappoint with a generous splash of all three. What was the most surprising thing you discovered about the building while researching this book?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I think it probably is the more sordid elements. I think the most surprising thing I discovered was not just the one murder, but that multiple people have died here. And I suppose that any building that has been around this long is going to have its share of tragedy. I do wonder if the Fine Arts Building has a little more than its share, maybe because it has so many tenants, maybe because it's never been a lockdown secured building. It's been a building people can come into for better and for worse. And so certainly, yeah, I write about the murder on the 10th floor, which was a drama teacher who, and this is interesting because I don't like to present murder and true crime as like this is entertainment for us. I mean, if somebody's life was lost, this was 1980. There's still probably some people alive who remember this or knew him or whatever. But it was at the same time, it feels like it was a case that was very befitting the Fine Arts Building. Everett Clark was an actor who had been a radio actor in the golden age of radio, the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Maybe he had a face for radio. I don't know. When TV came in, he kind of was suddenly his acting career seemed to be over. So he took a studio in the Fine Arts Building and became a beloved drama teacher and taught the art of acting for many years on the 10th floor. And one day he didn't come home, and his worried partner called the painter who had the studio next door to him. And this kind of speaks to maybe something of the community of the Fine Arts Building, right? That Everett's partner He lived on the north side, I think around Chicago and State. Knew the painter next door, called her. She went next door and knocked. There was no response. She found an elevator operator who, I don't know if it was Tommy Durkin or somebody else, who opened the studio and found him stabbed to death on there's a small practice stage in the corner of his studio, and he had been stabbed to death with a pair of scissors. Later, they found out by one of his former students. And, I kind of buried the lead here. The painter realized that she had heard earlier in the day Everett crying out, "No, Paul, no, God, no," which she heard things yelled all day long because he was teaching acting. So people would be acting out scenes or declaiming lines or whatever. She didn't think twice. And why would she? But that gave them their first clue that it would have been Paul who killed Everett. So they quickly searched for students named Paul, and they found their man in very little time at all.
Littered over the doorway just inside the Fine Arts building are the words, "All passes, art alone endures." Does seeing that when you walk in help motivate you and your writing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm, as an author, you realize that books often don't stay in print as long as you hope they will. So art endures to different degrees for sure, but it does inspire me. I think that, well, a lot of the books I write, I write generally what might be called commercial fiction. I write books that are meant to be entertaining. I am not trying to write the great American novel at the moment. I'm not ruling it out. But at the same time, it is very inspiring to come into a building where there are so many people who are so passionate about what they do. I'm not a woo-woo, new agey kind of person or whatever, but I do just feel like there's a good energy in the building. I love hearing the music of the building, whether it's in the halls or sometimes I'm working and you hear singing of all levels. Lyric opera singers will rehearse here, and I'll hear the most exquisite opera coming up the courtyard outside my window. But I'll also hear beginners next door, and that's inspiring too, because I think it's really important. Amateurism is great as well. Like, I think our culture sometimes just wants to reward professionalism and excellence. And I think it's really important that people feel like they can participate in the arts at any level. So I just I love seeing the whole mix, the whole range, and that amateur, that beginner, next door may well be singing for lyric opera in 10 or 20 years. Who knows? But yes, and I hope too that, it inspires people who visit the building and see those words. I hope it inspires them to become patrons of the arts and to support the artists in this building however they can. Maybe it's just, subscribing to somebody's newsletter. Maybe it's attending a performance. Maybe it's buying a book. Maybe it is getting involved and just coming out to see more arts, because arts don't exist without an audience.
You mentioned inspiration, you mentioned passion. In your bio, you refer to yourself as a half-hearted high school student, but now you have a career writing books and seemingly doing what you want to do. What advice do you have for teens and even college age students trying to find their way?
Yeah, it's something that I give a lot of thought to, and my answer has kind of evolved over the years, because the thing about writing is that there's no single path to success. The things I typically fall back on saying are, you must be a reader. You must read voraciously if you wish to become a writer. I sometimes meet young writers who don't recognize that part of it, but reading is how we learn to write. And also that begins to immerse you in the writing ecosystem, because you are then supporting other writers. And I don't know how you can expect other people to support you as a writer if you don't support others. I remember a lesson I learned early on in my writing career. A friend of mine who published a book, he was the first of my friends to publish a book, had a book party. Rick Kogan came, the great Rick Kogan, and Rick bought a half dozen books. And my friend said to him, "Rick, wow, you didn't have to buy that many books." And Rick just said, in his inimitable radio voice, it's like, "You always buy the book," and it's just so true. It's like you have to participate in it. So the next thing I say to writers who want to make is, you must participate. And that can mean just going to readings. And the amazing thing is, like, literary readings are usually free, and they're usually not very big. And if you hang around for a few minutes, usually you can get a few minutes of the author's time. When I came to Chicago from Montana, I had one friend in the city. And I used to just wonder how on earth I would ever kind of penetrate the walls of this city, or these massive organizations or these buildings. Like, how would I ever become a part of the cultural fabric? It just seemed absolutely impossible. And the answer is that it doesn't happen overnight. It takes a long, long time. I've now lived here, coming up on 3 decades, and it's been getting out and participating and meeting people and just, I guess the third thing I would say to the aspiring writers is you got to do it. You got to do the work and you've got to write, and don't wait for the perfect word and don't wait for the perfect project. Write a lot now and be willing to fail a lot now. And eventually those failures turn into successes.
That's great advice and a solid Rick Cogan impression.
I've been a fan of his for years, and he's been such a talk about a supporter of artists. I directed a play in the year 2000, and I was nobody. And I invited Rick Cogan because he was Rick Cogan, and he came. He came to the opening night, and I just thought, wow, unbelievable.
For any listener not familiar with Rick Cogan, he is a longtime Chicago newspaper columnist who has written numerous books about this city and hosts After Hours with Rick Cogan on WGN Radio. 100 or so years from now, what is one thing, other than the 2025 book about it, that you would like future Chicagoans to know about the Fine Arts Building?
I hope that it is still standing, still doing fulfilling exactly the same function it is now. Because something I talk about in the book is, and I alluded to briefly earlier, is that this is not, it's been a gift to the city of Chicago by a series of owners. It's had close calls. There was a time when the land under the building was worth more than the building itself, and there was serious talk of selling it and demolishing the building, which is just horrifying. I still shudder to think about it. It makes me nervous, even though it didn't happen. None of the owners are obligated to keep it for its current purpose. But in modern times, each one of the owners has recommitted to that, whether it was Tom Graham or Bob Berger, who, was not necessarily a loved figure in Chicago real estate circles or even by the artists who were his tenants. But when he bought the building, he said he was only going to rent to artists, which is pretty remarkable because I'm sure he could have made more money, renting it to other people. And his daughter, Erica Berger, who took over rather suddenly after Bob died, has doubled down on what he has done and pumped money into this building and just recommitted to the vision of maintaining this place. So, it's been Chicago's good fortune. It's been my good fortune that these owners have been, enlightened owners. And I hope that 100 years from now, we can look back and say that we had another half dozen or hopefully just a few owners who continued to see the value and the vision and kept the rents reasonable and provided a place for the just astonishing diversity of arts that take place under this roof.
All right. I have a few more questions for you. Are you ready?
I'm ready, I hope.
What is your pizza order on a Friday night?
Oh, my pizza order. So I recently moved to the south suburbs, I will say, after more than 2 decades in Uptown. And I'm by the original Aurelio's, which is a phenomenal place. Their pizza is second to none, in my opinion. So I'm probably going to go with like spinach and tomato and garlic. If I'm feeling spicy, I might do like pineapple and jalapeno or giardiniera, actually. Thin crust all the way.
You lived in Uptown, not exactly known for a ton of parking options. So then I have to ask this question. Dibs after a snowstorm, acceptable or unacceptable?
So I did not have a car for almost all of my time in Chicago. We bought a car to teach our kids how to drive because we didn't want them to not know how to drive. My feeling on dibs has always been it should be about 24 hours. I mean, I get it. Like if you shovel that spot out and then you need to run to Jewel. Okay, put a chair in it, come right back. But when you see people holding on to it 2 weeks later, not okay.
When ordering a hot dog, what do you like on it?
Everything but ketchup.
Speaking of hot dogs, have you ever ordered one at Home Depot? Shout out to Fixin' Frank's.
I have had a Home Depot hot dog, although definitely Byron's on Irving Park was my go-to for many years. Yeah.
Outstanding. Do you have a favorite Chicago band or musician?
Chicago band or musician. That is a tough one. This is going to sound so lame. It's going to be like, but like if there's one album that I'm gonna get behind the wheel and I want to floor it, and I just want to get in the mood that I had all through my youth. It would be Urge Overkill Saturation. I'm not gonna say they're my favorite band, but that album still works for me.
It's a great choice. One more question for you. If you're ordering a Chicago handshake at a bar, what are you expecting to receive?
What, like PBR and a Malort, I would imagine.
Nicely done. Yes, I would have also accepted old style, but
Old style,
it
yeah.
changes depending on where you go. I will commend you on something. I have shelves and shelves of history books written by history nerds. They're very dry and very facts, 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 list, which kind of bore me. You being a writer first and then getting into this history game really lent itself to just a fresh, new, exciting book, and it was a pleasure to read.
Thank you so much. That means a lot to me. I'm very pleased to hear it. I have had some nerves about releasing this book because Chicago is full of amazing historians and people who love the city so much and who've done far more research than I ever could or would. But this was the story that, kind of fell in my lap and I fell in love with. And, I went deep as I could. And I look forward to, I know that, people are going to come to me, at events and stuff, and they're going to say, oh, did you know this or that? And I'm excited to learn more because who knows, maybe there's another edition of this building. But really what I tried to do was to tell the story because I am a storyteller and I wanted to make it, I labor over the words for sure. And I wanted to make it a book that people would just enjoy reading and that, I don't ever want, facts or dates to keep people away from learning the exciting story about this building. So I tried to balance just enough of that with the story and the people. And this is a story and a building that is made by the people in it, and hopefully that comes through.
Keir Graff's new book, Chicago's Fine Arts Building, Music, Magic, and Murder, is set for release Tuesday, June 3rd. Keir, thanks for your time.
Oh, thank you so much, Tommy. Delightful to be here. And this is the first conversation I've had about the book. So we're kicking it off, and I can't think of a better way.
Thanks for listening to today's episode about Chicago's Fine Arts Building. If you have any questions, anything to add, or just want to say hi, feel free to send me an email at chicagohistorypod@gmail.com. Special thanks to my guest, Keir Graff, and to Lauren Ball at Trope Publishing for putting this together. To order a copy of Graff's book, check for links in the show's notes or ask at your local bookshop. Anything you buy through those links, not just the items listed, may generate a small commission for this podcast at no additional cost to you. The art for most Chicago History Podcast episodes comes from my longtime friend, John K. Schneider. Thank you, Johnny. If you need creative work done, John K. is the dude for you. Reach out to him at angeleyesartjks@gmail.com. I will be back soon with more stories from Chicago's history. Until then, get out and explore when possible. Visit the Fine Arts Building. Learn more about whatever city you live in, and stay safe.